Good afternoon. I'm Jane Vossler, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center to our second travelogue of the season. So we have Bill Kallock with us today. He lives in Kallock with his wife and 2 kids, and he loves playing outside, sailing, hiking, mountain biking. And he said that he works for someone who is willing to give him some time off now and then so he can satisfy his longings for travel. So he's here today to share with us his trip to Patagonia in 2018. I'll turn it over to you, Bill.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a trip I took almost exactly 3 years ago. I left for this trip November 1st, 2018. So it has almost been 3 years, but it's still pretty vivid memories in my mind, for sure. Just to put it in context, the trip took place in Chile, in the southern part of Chile, down in the Patagonia region. So there's a indication where Chile is in South America, and then this circle shows you basically the fjords of Chile, and that's where we were sailing, and we did some trekking down there. There's an overview of the route that we took sailing. We left Puerto Montt and sailed down through the fjords of Chile out into the Pacific for a little bit there, as you can see kind of in the middle, and then back in and down through Puerto Eden and down to Punta Arenas. One thing to keep in mind about this part of the world is that there is not very many settlements or cities or villages on this route. Puerto Eden was the only place really to stop along the way. For sailing, we had the really fortunate pleasure of sailing on my friend's Boreal 47. It's a 47-foot expedition boat named Astro. And Astro is an all-aluminum boat and built to sail in high latitudes, so up in the Arctic or down in the Antarctic. It does have a retractable keel and can get into some pretty tight places. This is, if you are going to be in Patagonia sailing, this is the boat that you want to be sailing on. And I was lucky enough to have a friend who owns one and invited me to go sailing with him. This was the crew. There was 4 of us on the boat for 21 days sailing. It was actually total trip was about 28 days with these guys. Joel, or John, is the owner of Astro. John is a friend from business school. He was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro. He's an avid adventurer and sailed Astro for 20,000 nautical miles over 3 years. So he knows his boat very well. Actually, Joel and I sailed Astro from the Straits of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean to Athens, Greece, prior to this trip. So I also knew his boat pretty well by this point. The next guy in the picture there with the glasses and the hat in the background, that's me. As Jane said, I'm an outdoors enthusiast. About 25 years before this trip, I had actually ridden my bike from Santiago, Chile to Cape Horn. So knew the area fairly well from that trip, and another reason that Joel wanted to be on board. And the third guy was Odd Arnie. He's a Norwegian. He also owns a Boreal 44. He's a great guy. One of the things that he brought to the trip was he is a very knowledgeable diesel mechanic. He was a MotoGP or a motorcycle racer back in Europe in the days, and was sponsored by Toyota and knows engines incredibly well. The fourth guy there on the trip is Chris. He's British. Another awesome guy to have on the trip. He was a professional captain on super yachts. So he sails super yachts around the world. And my friend Joel met Chris in Martinique and talked him into joining us for this trip. So we had a very great crew, international crew. We all met in Puerto Montt, Chile. Joel had sailed the boat down from the Galapagos Islands, and it was on the hard or up on the land, as you can see in the right picture there. It had been up on the land for a few days, well, for a couple of weeks, and it needed some repairs from the transport down from the Galapagos. So we had to fix a couple things, including the bow thruster. There was a hatch that was leaking, and we all scratched our heads and said, well, one of the things that's challenging about sailing in Patagonia is there's not that great places to anchor, and we wanted to make sure that we were going to be able to pull all that anchor chain back in. So we tested that out as well. So as you can imagine, 4 guys on a boat for basically 21 days, 3 weeks, almost 4 weeks. And there was no place, no marina to pull in, no place to resupply. We needed to buy a lot of groceries before we set out. So in Puerto Montt, not only did we do a bunch of work on the boat, but we went grocery shopping. We were happy to find that there was an Uber's were down there so that we could get back and forth to the grocery store with all these groceries. As you can see, we had plenty of beer and plenty of toilet paper, it looks like. No, but we ate very well, and it was the boat was able to take enough provisions for the trip without a problem. So that was great. One of the challenges of sailing down in a region like Patagonia is that there's not a whole lot of people down there, and the charts are pretty uncertain. But we did have good information to pick up this guidebook, Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego Nautical Guide. And this was the Bible for sailing down there. If you're ever going to be down there, this is the book to get. It's got detailed instructions on all the potential anchorages along the way. So you can see here an example page and some of the details that we used to get into some pretty tight anchorages. And you'll see later on why that was really key. So after about 5 days or so of rainy, cold weather in Puerto Montt, Astro was ready to go. We had to watch the tides. Puerto Montt has some pretty big tides. Here's high tide and low tide, so it's pretty big swings there. So we headed out. Well, actually, we got ready to head out, and that night before we left, there was this swarm of creatures, of small little things around the bottom of the boat, and it turned out to be krill. I had never seen krill in my life, and krill is really the basis of the food chain in the high latitudes, right? It's what the whales eat. It's what penguins eat. So that's what krill looks like. It's the first time I've ever seen it. So after the 5 rainy days, the sun came out on the morning that we were leaving, and we could finally see the beautiful volcanoes of Patagonia. This is volcano Osorno, which was just north of Puerto Montt. You can see another volcano there in the district, and those volcanoes are in the Lake District of Chile, which is just a beautiful area with these stunning volcanoes and beautiful lakes. So really great part of the world. So we left from there and we began our trip south. The black dots you see here are where we anchored at night. We could not sail at night in these conditions, in these waters. One is because the charts weren't always that accurate. And 2, the weather was constantly changing. It would go, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but definitely the weather was something you had to keep an eye on, and it wasn't possible at night. So here we are heading out and heading our way south finally. And you can see it's a beautiful day. This is probably in about 65 degrees. You couldn't get a better day. So we headed south here. It was kind of cool. We were first day out. We were joined by some dolphins swimming alongside of us here. So we thought that was a pretty good omen. First day out, we're seeing this peak, or this island, I should say, and we couldn't find it on any charts. We didn't quite know where this island was, and we were kind of learning our way around between the charts and the visual down there. And this is us just kind of cruising along. beautiful conditions. But anyhow, that's the peak that we were looking at. And the reason we couldn't find it on any of the charts is our visibility was over 100 miles away. So it was, well over the curvature of the Earth, and we needed to adjust our thinking of how far away things were that we were seeing in the distance. So that was definitely something that took getting used to over the first couple days. During the first part of the journey, we did see a lot of fishermen. Here's a little fishing boat. This was pretty much the only people that lived in this area were fishermen, are fishermen. This is a shot of Astro at anchor during the first couple nights. We had some beautiful sunsets. We had some on and off rain over the first few days. You can see the beautiful rain. There's Odd and Joelle doing some work on the lines. Some more beautiful shots of the mountain. And just really quiet, picturesque anchorages. There's obviously nobody around on the land. So we really we were all by ourselves. And it just made for some really magical nights. Here's a shot of the moon, and there's actually, I think, a shot somewhere of the Southern Cross, which is basically the equivalent of our Big Dipper, but down in the south. This next two slides here is a bit of a comic relief. So we would get into our anchorages, and we'd, go for a little paddle and look around. And one of the things that we had been looking for back in Porto Montt when we were getting our supplies together was a crab trap. The crabs down there, big king crabs, are called centolla. And we wanted to take a crab trap with us so that we could catch centolla. And Odd and Chris, on one of their excursions after we anchored, found this blue box, which, as Odd is demonstrating it, was a toilet. Was something that had fallen overboard from one of the fishing boats or something. But the box didn't have a bottom to it or anything. It was just this plastic square. So we had the brilliant idea of, hey, we can make a crab trap out of this. We've got some netting left over from the boat, and we can work something up. So here you see Chris deploying our crab trap for the first time. So every night we would get into the anchorage. That would be one of the first things we would do is to put our crab trap over and see if we could catch any crab. So interesting, the reuse of some garbage that we found out there. This is another spectacular view. There really was the first week was just unbelievably clear and great weather. But as we were heading down one of the bays here, sort of where the fishermen were and things like that, we were going along in about 15 knots of wind. We had the main up, we had the jib out, and we were cruising along at good 8 knots. Everything was great, and then the wind started to build to 20 knots, and then 25 knots, and then 30 knots, and we're starting to get a little worried here. Okay, so now we're going downwind with the wind behind us at 30 knots. We have a main sail full up. We have a full jib, and we are flying down these waves. So we decided that we needed to take some sails down. We're getting a little overpowered. And fortunately, we were going downwind. Well, fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately, going downwind makes it really hard to reef the sail because of the pressure on the sail. But we were able to, we got Chris and Joelle up there. I took the wheel. And the next thing I know, we're driving down these waves. The wind has picked up to 40 knots. And we are way overpowered. And but the boat is just loving this. It was just loving 40 knots downwind. And we were able to get the mainsail down and roll up the jib. And to kind of protect our sails, we didn't want to ruin anything at this big part of the trip. I think this was like day 4 of the trip that this was happening. Next thing we knew, the 40-knot squall that had come through sort of died down, and it fell back down to maybe 25. But it didn't last very long. But that kind of gave us a warning for the rest of the trip. And it was one of the reasons that they advise you not to sail at night. This is the other reason they advise you not to sail at night. What you see here, the orange triangle or the red triangle there is the path. Well, is our boat, and the yellow line is the path that we were taking. And it really shows that we went right over the land, which obviously was not the case. This is just an example of bad charts. The water actually did go right where we were. As a result, this is how we entered many of the anchorages. You all was on the helm. We usually had somebody standing up on the boom looking down for obstacles. And of course, we had somebody up on the bow checking things out. Again, we are completely isolated from just about anybody. We hadn't run into people in a few days at this point. So if we did hit a rock or have any problems or needed a tow, nobody was going to come get us. The Chilean Navy did request when we had talked to them, they did request that we check in with them on a daily basis, just to make sure that things were okay. And they would probably, if we hadn't checked in on a daily basis, they would probably send somebody for us, but they would have a pretty large area to look for. So we were really on our own. But that was okay with us because we got to be in some pretty spectacular places. Here's a rainbow as we were at Anchorage this night. Just a spectacular night. And here's a shot of me enjoying the beautiful weather. This was obviously a much lighter wind day. And here is our first catch of crabs. These weren't the centolla crabs, but they were small crabs and edible. And we boiled them up while we were sailing along the next day and had a little crab feast going on. So very fun. You know, occasionally we did see these floating floating houses. They're not really houses. They're actually fish farms. So these would be farmers farming pretty much salmon, I think, was the big fish that they were farming there. And they would be in these floating houses, and there would be nets, and you would definitely stay away from them. But we did not see, well, maybe we saw one of these every other day, but we didn't see very many people associated with them. We did see one cruise ship the whole time, and this came through probably in the first week. It was a French cruise ship, but we never saw that again. And we did go down, as I said, these are fjords, so there's islands or land that comes down pretty close on both sides. This is one of the glassiest that you'll ever see the Patagonia seas. It was just so tranquil this day. It was kind of amazing. There's a quick shot of inside the boat just to show you that we weren't roughing it too much. The inside of Astro was wonderful. We had cabins. We had a raised a table that we ate at, and most of the food was stored on the benches. And we had a head, and we also had a diesel heater. So every night after we'd anchor, we'd fire up the diesel heater, and that really helped because the nighttime temperatures were probably down into the 40s. Water temperature was in the 40s. And this is basically the Chilean spring leading into the summer, but it was definitely cold and wet. Here's speaking of cold and wet. Here's as you all going for a swim, and you would think why would he choose to go for a swim in these weather conditions? And it actually had to do with the crab trap. unfortunately, the crab trap at night when the boat was swinging around, and the crab trap got jammed between the boat and the rudder. So he had to go overboard and free that. But nothing, no damage or anything. We just had to be more careful with where we put the crab trap. So that was the first part of the trip. As you could tell, it was pretty tranquil. Had some beautiful nights, and that was a really good start of the trip. The middle third of the trip, and one of the first things that we had to do was to go out around the fjords and go out in the Pacific Ocean. I had taken this trip 25 years ago on a ferry, and we went out into the ocean, and we were out into the ocean for about the Pacific Ocean for 24 hours, and everybody on the ferry was completely seasick for 24 hours. So I was kind of dreading this first part of the journey. But we headed out. You can see the gray skies, again, about 40 degrees, maybe 50 degrees. We had fantastic winds, and we had nice seas. So it was not the same as the experience that I had 25 years before. We had rain, of course, but we had nice winds, about 20 knots, 25 knots. And we were able to make the passage out through the Pacific without too many complications. And I say without too many, because in the middle of the night, while we're out there, we actually crossed another sailboat within a quarter of a mile. There was another sailboat out there. We had a radar, of course, and we could see it, but we also had a vessel identification system, which is called AIS. And we could see that it was a sailboat, and we could see what direction and everything on this display from the AIS. And we hailed them, and we said, "Hey, we're Astro, and we're coming through." And we actually asked them to tack, which in retrospect was not very friendly, because they were struggling as much as anybody sailing in Patagonia at night. So we were a little embarrassed by that, and here we are coming into back into the fjords. We're going 8 knots with just a jib up. But so that sailboat, we ended up fine. Everything was good. They went on their way. We went on our way. There we are, headed down, coming back into the fjords. You can see that things have kind of changed in terms of the weather. We're now seeing consistent winds of 30 to 35 knots. Most of the time, all the time, it was coming out of the north, so it was always behind us. Here we have just a little bit of jib up. We're probably doing 8 knots with a little bit of jib. The seas are white capped for sure, probably 2 to 3 foot, maybe a meter to 2 meters, 3 to 6 feet at this point. One of the things that Odd was really, really good at was photography, and he took these beautiful shots of this albatross that we saw and a southern giant petrel. Just fantastic pictures. And here's some more wildlife. We woke up one morning to these guys playing around just outside the boat, looking for their breakfast. This is a family of seals. And it was really, really pretty cool to wake up on a cold, rainy morning to a bunch of seals kind of hanging out with you. Here's a better shot of those guys. Really fun. So one of the things that we had to do every time we came into an anchorage was to not only drop an anchor, but we actually had to tie the boat to shore with 2 lines, one on each side of the stern. And that was to prevent the boat from swinging in the winds as they change. And then, you could swing pretty violently and run into ground. So every time we anchored, we had to find exactly where we wanted the stern to be, and we'd back in, and then we'd go ashore. Here's Chris and I running some lines from the shoreline. And you can see here the difference between the water level and where the water is on the trees, that as the storms progress, the water can get up pretty high as it moves back and forth through the Pacific Ocean. Here's another shot of the boat. I don't know if you can see the stern lines there in this one, but they're the light blue lines. I don't even know if I have a pointer, but they're the light blue lines headed to shore off the back there. So you can see that we would nestle in the stern pretty close to shore, as close as we could go. And we did have the ability to raise the centerboard, so we could get pretty and tight. We could draw. I think the lowest we would draw is about 6 feet, so we could get pretty tight in the shore there. We did have, not only the challenges of the weather and the wind, but we did have our autopilot break at one point. So we did a fair amount of manual steering, but the autopilot was definitely doing a lot of it downwind, especially when we had just a jib up or some smaller sails. The autopilot did a great job going downwind. But here we've got Joel and I think that's Chris down working on the autopilot connection. Fortunately, they were able to get it fixed, and we were able to move on. So here's a good example of the squalls that would come through. So we'd have a beautiful blue skies, as you kind of see hiding up in there, and then all of a sudden we could see this big black cloud come across, and the wind would jump from 20 knots to 40 knots pretty quickly. So you really had to be on your toes. We actually went in shifts all day long, 4-hour shifts. Each of us took a shift, and we're responsible for keeping an eye on the weather as well as adjusting the sails and making sure that we were following the right course. And it's a good thing that we did that, because this guy did not do that. This is a relic of a ship that had obviously run aground not too far off the channel. So this was a reminder to us that the charts were only so good, and we needed to keep our eyes out for unmarked shoals, rocks, and things that may have changed. So we made it down through that middle section of the trip, and now we're getting down into the only town that we were going to come to, and that's the town of Porto Eden. Porto Eden was a town, according to the guidebook, of about 300 people at one point. By the time we had gotten there, the red tide had devastated the shellfish industry, and that's what Porto Eden was there. It was definitely a fishing village. And the population of Porto Eden, while we were there, had dropped from 300 to only 60 people. So to call it a town was kind of a stretch. What you're actually looking at in this picture on the land there with the blue roof is the only grocery store in town. And here's a shot of the inside of the grocery store. And this is the only place over 3 weeks of sailing that we could restock. And they had they had plenty of candy, as you can see from the shelf behind them. They had some eggs, actually quite a stack of eggs, and liquor and beer, but not too much else. Definitely no produce. Here's our boat Astro anchored in Porto Eden, and you can see behind us there's actually 2 other sailboats. If you look towards the shore there, those it turned out to be the boat that we almost ran into in the middle of the night as we were going south, and another boat from New Caledonia, which is an island just off of New Zealand. And we ended up making friends with the folks on the boat from New Caledonia, which is, it was these two ladies and the curly-haired guy in the background there. And they were a really fun group of people. They had sailed over from New Caledonia and mostly spoke French, but we were able to communicate with them, despite the fact that we had no French speaker. So this was pretty much our only human contact outside the four of us over basically 3.5 weeks. So that was a nice evening that we got to spend. The next morning we left Porto Eden. Sorry, it was one of those glassy, beautiful mornings, and it just lent itself to these really striking pictures, and also striking to see sort of the way that this fishing village was set up. With all the moisture and rain, we were surrounded on all sides by these waterfalls just rushing down the sides of mountains. And you can kind of see the waterfall there in the middle, but you can imagine the amount of moisture that was down there. One of the things about this area of Chile is the Andes there have the second largest ice cap in the world. It's a stretch of the Andes is just covered by ice. And so there's several places where that ice cap comes down and meets the water. And we decided to, right after we went to Porto Eden, to head up and to check out that ice cap. So we tacked all day long, and we went up to this glacier, which was just, it was really hard work. It was blowing 30 knots that we were going. It's just, one of those things you got to keep your eye out for things as you're going down. You'll see those dolphins. We had this group of whales that we saw. Occasionally we'd see some penguins swimming by. But you definitely had to keep your eye out, because here's another shipwreck that we came across not too far off the channel. So you wanted to keep an eye on where the channels were and what was going on. So that was the middle third of the trip. And then the last third is actually coming down and going through the Straits of Magellan, which was a dream of mine since I was a little kid studying Magellan. So we came down here, and I'll show you what that was like. But as we were coming down to an anchorage one night, we finally saw a fisherman. And Chris said, "Let's go get him." So we went over to the fisherman, and in sign language, we kind of told him we were looking for a trade. We wanted to know if he had any centolla. So we ended up trading him, I think, a box of wine for, I think, 3 or 4 king crabs. These beautiful, beautiful crabs. And this was getting on towards just around Thanksgiving time, because we ended up eating these crabs for Thanksgiving dinner. So you can see here, this is showing that the true wind speed at this point is 40 knots. It's in the middle of the display, or middle right-hand side of the display. And just really blowing hard. There was a big low pressure coming that was saying that basically it was going to blow 50 knots and have 5-meter waves for the next 3 days. As we were going into the Straits of Magellan, which once we headed into the Straits of Magellan, we're no longer headed due south. We had to actually turn and go east. So the winds and the low pressure coming out of the west was going to be a major challenge for us. So we ended up finding a beautiful, really protected anchorage. You can see here we've got Astro tucked in here really tight to this anchorage. And this was the nighttime true wind speed. You can see here it did kind of get mellow for a little bit of time, but then the wind picked up again. Then it was always between basically 30 and 48 knots. So This was a low pressure system coming through. We were hunkered down pretty tight. You can see behind these hills. We did have some beautiful sunsets, but it was definitely lulling us into a sense of security. This is from the top of the knoll looking down on Astro. You can see the wind on the water whipping by, and you can see Astro rocking back and forth. This was definitely difficult for us to stand up in this wind, but at the same time, you can see the scenery was just unreal, just different, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Here are some spring flowers on this really rough, tough-looking plant, and these beautiful spring flowers. We took the time while we were in this anchorage. We actually ended up holding up here for about 4 days while the low pressure went by to do some chores. And this is Chris actually putting some saran wrap over the port. What happened is while you're in your cabin, you're breathing out air and moisture, and that moisture would condense on the glass above, and then it would drip down on top of you. So you'd be sleeping at night and you'd be feeling water dripping down on top of you. So Chris had this brilliant idea to take the wood down and put saran wrap over it, and it worked really well. I, on the other hand, decided to take my hand at baking bread. So made a bunch of bread while we were at waiting out the storm, waiting out the low pressure, which was delicious. Here's looking out over the hillside to the Straits of Magellan. It looks pretty good, but again, the reports were still for 50 knots of wind. And then it finally broke, and we were able to head out. And I just wanted to show you quickly this video that shows you just how incredible this anchorage was. It was, again, in that Bible, the guide, the nautical guide. We would never have attempted to go in here without that guide telling us that there was plenty of water and how to find the entrance to this little cove, this little bay. And you can see that it's not very big compared to the size of the boat. And, if you didn't know that it was, I can't remember what it was, 30 meters there, you would probably not have taken a boat in there given the remoteness of it. So then we set out into the Straits of Magellan, blowing 50 knots. We have a blade. We have to kind of go into the wind. This was definitely one of the roughest parts of the trip. We spent about 5 hours pounding against these waves before we could turn the corner. But it was definitely worth it. And then we finally turned the corner, and we headed around to Punta Arenas. And I finished up my tour with the guys at this point in Joal, and we found another fisherman. Fishermen were much more plentiful after we made the turn. We found some more fishermen that traded us these huge king crabs. We had actually kept them in a little bit of water for a while, and we had a feast, and this was on this night. This point of land is actually the southernmost point in South America. So before South America breaks into a set of islands, Tierra del Fuego, in other words, this is the geographic end of South America. You can see the cross up there on the hillside. These are my co-crew guys, and this was my last day on the boat. And that night we came across a fisherman who decided he wanted to trade us a octopus for some beer. And here he's teaching us how to tenderize the octopus. You had to smack it on the deck at least 20 times, according to him, to make it a good eating. So I didn't get to try the octopus, because I had left the boat. This was as far south as I got, 53 degrees south, which was really quite the experience. A beautiful time on the boat. And it was really, really tough to say goodbye to Astro. But I went to Punta Arenas, and to begin the next part of the trip here. And my wife, Emily, flew down to Punta Arenas and joined me for a trip into Torres del Paine National Park. So you can see here Punta Arenas, and then you can see Torres del Paine just north of that, back up towards the area where Porto Eden was. And Torres del Paine is this fantastic national park, really well known internationally as for its beauty and its stunning peaks, and the Torres, which are the towers. And you kind of see them in this picture, but we'll show you more. So here's an outline of the park. There is basically a loop of trails with some trails that go inside. There is a trek that people do. There's actually two treks that people do. One is the O trek, and the O trek goes all the way around the towers that are the peaks that you see there. So it goes along the lakes up to Glacier Gray, and then up and around. And then there's also the W trek. And the W trek is the hike I had done 25 years ago. And so we were back in the same area, and we did a trip with REI, and this is our REI group. I think there's 12 of us and 2 guides, and this was just a fantastic time, and I would highly recommend taking any kind of trip with REI. They just did a fantastic job. We stayed at this eco camp, which was basically these geodesic domes that were put up because they have a low footprint on the earth. The beautiful location you can see there in the bottom left, just right underneath the mountains. And all this, none of this was there, of course, when I was there 25 years ago. It was basically a farmer's field that we pitched our tent in. But this eco camp was amazing. There's our 2 guides, Claudia and Roberto. And they had the beautiful thing about going with guides is, as you probably have guessed by now, is the uncertainty of the weather in Patagonia. And these guys had plans A through Z. So depending upon what the weather was, and how people were doing, they would change sort of the itinerary. We had on the itinerary to go hiking, to go kayaking, to go mountain biking, and more hiking. And they were really great at adjusting everything and really making sure that everybody had a great time. There's a fantastic shot. We totally lucked out with the weather in Torres. This can be one of the most brutal areas. Torrential rains, high winds, low visibility. But we had just some amazing bluebird days. Very fortunate. We actually went up to Glacier Gray, where we were supposed to kayak up into the glacier, but the winds were too strong, and we were not able to go on kayaks. So we ended up just taking the ferry or the sightseeing boat up to the glacier, and then coming back. You can see in the bottom right an example of the suspension bridge across rivers. That was really, really very picturesque. And here's an example of the winds that we're talking about that they wouldn't let us kayak in for some reason. I think they were worried that we were going to get blown to Antarctica. But it was, some days it just got crazy windy, and some days it was just calm, which was amazing. Here's a picture of a guanaco, which is basically like a llama. That there were tons of these down there, and really pretty amazing to get that close to one. We spent one day, we went in and hiked back into the backcountry of the Torres Park there, and went to visit these wild horses. These are just back in the hillside, just beautiful animals. We saw lots of other things. The upper left here is the ibis, and then a wild orchid there in the middle, and a red fox on the right. The red fox was actually tormenting the eco camp for a while. He'd make all kinds of noise at night, howling around. But I assume, of course, he was just looking for food. And then after basically a week of hiking and getting everybody ready and doing some shorter hikes and some longer hikes, the last day that we were there, we hiked up to the Torreys, which was a 14-mile round trip hike and about 1,000 feet of elevation gain up this valley. And this is, again, a hike I had done previously in another life, and it was just really, really amazing to be able to share it with my wife and show her this beautiful area. You can see here we've got Roberto leading us along. And then you can see climbing up the last pitch here, you see the people in the middle. So this is remnants of a glacier that had retreated. And then we got up to the top, and there are the 3 towers of the Torres del Paine and our whole REI group. So you get up to the top of this pitch, there's a lake up there and the towers, and lots of people come to this part of the world to climb those towers. And it's just a spectacular place to be. I'm so lucky I got to experience it. Anyhow, that was our sailing and hiking adventure in Patagonia. That was definitely one of the highlights of my life, and I'm really grateful to be able to share it with you. I just want to leave you with a quote here. It's a big world out there. Go explore. So thank you very much for letting me present today. And if you have any questions, we can open it up.
Thank you, Bill. That was really spectacular. The trip and the photos were just wonderful. Does anyone have any questions?
Did you do any fishing while you were out there for food? Or?
We did not do any fishing. Actually, none of the 4 of us were kind of intrepid fishermen. And given the most of the industry down there, was either farmed raised fish, or it was shellfish or crabs that they were after. So we didn't really see any fishermen, quote, fishing for fish.
And with your electronics on the boat, did you run batteries? Did you have a generator? Wind? How did you charge batteries for your electronic equipment?
Yeah, actually, we had solar panels. So above, right behind where the main wheel was in the cockpit there were 2 solar panels above that, and actually also a wind turbine.
Okay.
So we were able to keep the batteries charged from that. But we did have to keep an eye on it, for sure. Mm-hmm. We did have a diesel generator as a backup, and we could turn that on. But we did not want to waste any diesel.
Right. So why did you pick that season of the year to do it?
Well, that actually was the best season to do it in, believe it or not. That was actually going spring into summer down there. So any other time of the year, the weather is much worse than what we encountered. Yep.
Looks like a fun trip.
Do you have any more adventures planned, Bill?
Well, the pandemic has kind of put a damper on sort of international exploration for a little while. Joel, so after I left them to go to the REI trip, Joel and Chris and Odd took Astro down to Porto Williams, which is right on Cape Horn. And then they left for Christmas. It was Christmas time by then. And then Joel went back with another friend, and they sailed the boat up to Montevideo in Paraguay. And I had to actually look up on my map up here. And the boat's been on the hard in Montevideo since then. So I've been in touch with Joel, and we've been planning next trips and where he ought to bring the boat. I'd love to see him bring it up and go do some sailing up towards Alaska. I think that would be a really cool place.
Yeah, that'd be great. Any other questions? Ray, did you have something more?
What a great trip.
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. It was an incredible trip. I'm so lucky that the company I work for was allowed me to take off the time to go do it. And that I think it definitely rejuvenated me and made me more appreciative of the company.
And thank you so much for sharing it with us so we could vicariously experience it. Thanks.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me today.
That was great.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
We'll say goodbye then.
Okay. Thank you, Jane, for setting
Bye,
this
Bill.
up. Thank you, everybody,
Thanks.
for attending.